The West is by some metrics one of the best places on planet Earth to live. Life expectancies are high, healthcare is good, political and social freedoms are more or less guaranteed by the government.
The "Fuck Joe Biden" chant trend keeps growing across the country.
And there is food, water, and opportunity in plentiful abundance. Skeptical? Perhaps a look at immigration statistics may convince you. However, even with all of these blessings, the West has not become immune to problems. Recently, the issue of sexlessness in particular and loneliness more broadly among youths in many Western nations has come to light. According to a few famous studies, the populations of these countries are in the throes of what is being called a sex recession, and it is fast becoming accepted that loneliness is quickly approaching crisis levels.
Millennials get blamed for a lot. Now a federally funded study finds that they're having less sex than any other generation.
The issue of loneliness, which the government acknowledges is rampant throughout the UK, but really around the world, and they want to take this very seriously and address it and come up with programs.
It should therefore be unsurprising that a problem of this magnitude would begin to affect certain aspects of Western society, including the music produced there. In this installment, we are going to explore the rise of a sexless and lonely generation in the West and how that is changing popular music in the modern era. Welcome to Musica Explorations. Let us return to the simpler, saner times of the year 2000. Y2K hasn't happened. George W. Bush is elected as President of the United States of America, Sydney hosts the Summer Olympics, and Sony released their PlayStation 2 console. This year also marks the period that some of the oldest of the millennial generation were being ushered into higher education. As a millennial, you might have been eager to get into college and have your first experience of unbridled independence, finally having an opportunity to test all current assumptions and perhaps adopt some new ones. This includes attitudes related to sex and relationships. According to some studies, Gen X and boomers before them were fairly sexually active young adults. The average age for a first sexual encounter in the 60s was around 20 for women and just a tad bit lower for men. Popular music at the time was heavily focused on topics like relationships and love. Blatant mentions of sex were rare and visual depictions rarer still. Most popular songs were also composed in major keys, meaning they sounded happy, and the timbral variety or the diversity of sound was lush. As the years rolled on, the boomers graduated, started their adult lives, and it was the turn of Gen X to get into college. Building on the progress the boomers had built, the typical age for the first sexual encounter continued to fall. By 1990, it was around 17 years for both sexes, meaning it was expected that most young adults would have done away with their virginity just as they completed high school. Popular music changed a lot during this period. Timbral variety was no longer as varied as it was in the 60s. Musicians had become a lot less adventurous as far as chord changes and progressions were concerned, and a lot of major hits were now being composed in minor keys, meaning they were a lot more emotionally ambiguous. However, one aspect that remained stable through the years was the level of sexually explicit material in music. According to a study, there was virtually no change in the quantity of sexually explicit content in popular music from the 60s to the mid-90s. This is not to say it was never talked about. It was, but during this time, it was more implicit and indirect. While outliers like Madonna and Two Live Crew were beginning to make their mark, for the most part, explicit lyrics and visuals in songs continued to remain underground, with few ever making it onto the Billboard Hot 100. However, even the birth of such outliers began to make people think that entertainment of this kind might make youths even more eager to try out adult activities. This thought was especially worrying for a lot of socially conservative people that were convinced that this would let loose all kinds of problems, including out-of-control STIs, STDs, and teen pregnancies.
Parents should realize that we have explicit and graphic sex, extreme violence, suicide in lyrics that is going to children that are sometimes not even teenagers yet and young teenagers.
To you, bringing your kids up. If they know what's right and what's not right, they're going to do the right thing. My parents,
the question is, do you want the government to crack down on it? This is the point. This is the point.
The solution is what I did for a parent like you. I put a sticker on my record.
Well, there's another question here,
Parental guidance suggested.
You know,
for you to see. So when you see that sticker, you don't want your kid to get that record.
But if we arrest Luther, how come we're not arresting Madonna? And what is the difference? And how wavy is this line? Pretty interesting question to me.
America's favorite bad girl is doing it again, turning carefully crafted controversy into cash. We're talking, of course, about Madonna. Her risque new video, Justify My Love, has been banned on MTV, but as a result, is being broadcast just about every place else.
Two Live Crew does not, by law, have the right to say what they are saying. These women's lives are being shredded. Children's lives are being destroyed.
Our society is plagued
and sick
by sexual immorality, incest, teenage pregnancy, sexual assault, rape, and we wonder what's causing this.
This was ostensible reasoning because all those things didn't happen. Instead, depending on which sources you consult, during and after the year 2000, the median age for the first sexual encounter commenced its slow ascent. Now, this should have been a little confusing because while the median age for a first sexual encounter was inching up, popular media experienced a sharp increase in the amount of music now seemingly awash with messages of concupiscence. Research indicates that the early to mid-2000s had some of the highest musical references to sexual topics on the Billboard Top 40 up until that point. Of the top 40 songs on the Hot 100, about 1/3 of them had sexual references by the year 2005, a giant uptick from just a decade earlier. What was once considered extreme was now mainstream, and it had taken barely a decade for it to happen. By 2009, Billboard Hot 100 tracks were 3 times more likely to contain lyrics with pretty obvious sexualization than music from the previous century. This new loose attitude towards sex persists even to the present day. It is not an overstatement to observe that a music video in 2020 might have qualified as softcore pornography in the 1970s. Yet even when bombarded like this, a look at the stats shows us that younger millennials and Gen Z have less bedroom traffic than their forerunners. Given the big effect that music is supposed to have on young minds, it seems to have failed to push them into early and active sex lives. To some, this message evokes not a sense of worry, but of relief, and that is probably fair. But may I remind you that a few sometimes use sex as a proxy for a more troubling trend: loneliness. In the past decade, we have received warnings of just how lonesome life in the West has become for young people especially. In 2017, the UK reported that 9 million people in the country often or always felt lonely. A year later, a minister of loneliness was appointed. In that same year, about 50% of Americans reported that they sometimes or always felt alone, and the statistics coming out of Australia that same year said about 25% of survey participants reported being lonely. In 2019, Canada reported that 28% of households were solo, and in the EU, that number was around 34%. Take note, all of these numbers were before the pandemic, so it's more likely that things have only gotten worse since. If the young are being exposed to what should be dangerously excessive amounts of obscenity in both word and deed, how is it that we have failed to see the impact we were warned about? Let us look at the music itself to see if it can give us a few clues. One very noticeable trend in the evolution of modern popular music lyrics from the West has been the rise in mentions of anxiety and mental health issues. In the past decade or two, lyrics with messages of narcissism, depression, and heightened self-consciousness have earned spots as chart toppers, signaling their apparent popularity to listeners. This trend seems to follow the rise of a pretty obvious suspect: social media. Study after study after study after study has shown that the advent of many social media platforms is strongly linked to sharp increases in depression, loneliness, and of course, a lack of coital activity. From 2012 to 2018, the number of teenagers and young adults reporting loneliness nearly doubled among the most digitally connected youths. There was also a study conducted by US health insurance company Cigna, which found an increasing correlation between social media usage and feelings of loneliness. Now, many believe that social media cannot be said to cause loneliness, as that would be the same as saying that marriage causes divorce. Context remains key. However, a strong case is being made that social media might be exacerbating the problem. It is believed that the inherently comparative nature of social media could be driving already lonely youths deeper into their predicament.
I was looking and scrolling through and seeing these idealized versions of other people, and that was detrimental to my own self-worth and confidence. My sense of self was developing in this kind of bizarre duality between Instagram Ricky and real life Ricky.
Due to the overwhelming need to present perfection, self-consciousness that borders on social anxiety now plagues many millennials and Gen Zs. Sadly, this may also be slipping into the relationships and bedrooms of some that feel their bodies or personalities cannot compete with the flawlessness they see on social media. The pressure to always be top-notch has led a few young folks to the conviction that they are not fit to play some of the pleasure-filled games adults play with each other. Hence, one explanation could be that those that believe they are not good enough to play have decided to sit and watch. Now, we should note that social media really only blew up around the early 2010s. Music was already pretty well laced with sexuality by then, and loneliness, though not as bad, was already rearing its head. So while we can argue that social media has accelerated the trend, it would be unconvincing to say it caused it. If we want to find that, then maybe we should go a little further back.
2008 was a tumultuous year for the economy. The housing market collapse created one financial crisis after another, and it often seemed as if the news could only get worse. Here's a look back at the roller coaster that was our nation's economy in 2008.
The financial crisis of 2008 will be remembered as one of the worst economic disasters to impact the West and probably the world. Layoffs, unemployment, shutdowns, wage stagnation, and hiring freezes suddenly became more real than just news buzzwords in many households. As is often the case with disasters, the worst to be impacted were the least prepared, and in 2008, that was the freshly graduated millennials. Try and imagine what it was like for these bright-eyed individuals barely touching the ground before being tripped up by a big crisis.
2.6 million jobs were cut from the economy last year. That's the greatest decline since 1945.
If we measure how the economy is doing on the basis of employment, it's doing about as poorly as you can imagine.
In the years that followed, many millennials struggled to gain their financial footing, and COVID did them no favors.
Many are still recovering from the 2008 financial crisis. And now, millennials may be the hardest hit group by the economic turmoil of the pandemic.
Even as we speak, a large number are barely standing on their own financial feet. Speculation is that they never will, as the earnings statistics for those that graduated during past recessions offer very little consolation. Despite being the most educated and overworked generation, most millennials and Gen Zs are running late on many important milestones, such as becoming homeowners and marrying, and many cite economic insecurity as the main reason for the delay. The stress that comes with the financial pressure that most young adults have been facing is proving to be one of the most potent poisons for their bedrooms and relationships.
Both men and women are more career-focused and sacrifice relationships.
Stress about school, health finances, climate.
We don't have time.
Financial instability, global climate change, bad leadership. We're too busy trying to stop the planet from burning so we can still have sex when we're 70.
Less real connection, no chemistry.
Money finances, working too many hours,
spending
less
more
desire
time
for
focusing on our
committed
career than
relationships.
personal fulfillment.
Too many hours.
Financial instability, bad leadership.
According to the Cigna study once again, entry-level workers in the modern era scored significantly higher on the loneliness index than experienced workers, middle managers, and executives. This is thought to be happening because many are working unholy hours in an attempt to steady their financial stand. Work in the modern era seems like an auction for those just getting in. Many that are threatened with economic ruin are bidding off more of their time than is wise to part with. Now, talk of economic instability in music is not very common. However, what researchers have found is that anger in song lyrics does become more prevalent in music during times of economic hardship, more specifically during times of mass unemployment. A look at the Billboard may confirm that perhaps consumers of music in the West are indeed angry. Now, this is a more difficult point to prove since anger can come from a lot of different places. The increase in hymns filled with fury on our charts may be coming from political polarization, road rage, or a million other causes. It doesn't always have to be economic pressure. Also, if economic hardship causes lonely people to listen to angry music or pushes them to consume lascivious content because of no real action on their part, why haven't we seen these effects replicated in poorer countries? Academic statistics for listening patterns in poorer countries are hard to find, but a look at trending tracks doesn't seem to support that theory. Let us look at one other factor, a factor that might be a little controversial. It is no secret that religion in the West, Christianity more specifically, has been in decline for quite a while. America, the world's cultural hegemon, appeared for a long time to be the exception. More recently, it has been conforming to the rule. The rise of the nuns, as it is sometimes referred to, has generated a rich diversity of responses throughout American society.
I do think it's getting better.
Shelley Reese, a college professor, is one of them. She says the public mood on atheists is changing.
Well, by now, most of you probably know the rather depressing statistics about the nuns. I'm not talking about women religious, but the N-O-N-E-S, right? Those who claim no religious affiliation. The fastest growing religious group in America are the nuns. The latest survey showed that fully 25% of our country are now in the category of the nuns. That's 80 million people in our country would claim no religion. And among the young, so those like 30 and younger, it goes up to 40% would claim no religion. The other thing that's striking is this increase has been precipitous. When I was a kid, it would be a teeny tiny percentage of Americans would have claimed no religious affiliation.
What I want us to focus on, though, is the speed and period of this phenomenon. Using data from the General Social Survey, 87% of adults between the ages of 18 and 35 in the United States reported that they were Christians in 1991. Only 7 years later, that figure dropped to 73%, and the number of people reporting no religion rose from 8% to 20%. This decline was bigger and faster than anything that had happened since 1973, when the recording of this particular data set began. Many theories on what could have caused this have been tossed around. Was it the fall of the USSR? Or the marriage between the Republican Party and the religious right? Or perhaps it was the advent of the internet? Who knows? But take a good look at what happened to sexual expression in music as religion in the US became unattractive. The obvious interpretation of this trend is that it reflects a shift in American culture away from traditional religious standards of what constitutes acceptable sexual behavior. With religion losing its influence, youths in America seemed more eager to express their tolerance and even support of sexual activity outside the context of a heterosexual marriage. This move left some people in a strange social position. Religion provided people with community. It reminded people to maintain a sense of gratitude and awe, and it furnished people's lives with meaning and purpose. All these things are known to combat feelings of loneliness. When that got swept aside, not everyone that had discarded religion found a suitable replacement. So when the crises struck, more than a few were dangerously isolated without structures to enable the formation of platonic and romantic relationships. It is also ironic that an institution like the church may have provided an easier way for younger people to fornicate. Logistically, a bunch of youths already well acquainted with each other could only have smoothed the path to friendship, partnership, or even marriage. Since the weakening of the church's position in American culture, many youths have said that finding a socially connected group comparable to the ones religion provided is difficult. That is a claim that seems believable by looking at popular music. Now, while God or Abrahamic religions in general haven't featured much in popular music for almost a century, the lack of adherence to their values in music is probably the best illustration I can think of this cultural shift. If the kind of music people listen to says something about themselves, then what charts seem to indicate is that a large section of the youth in society have been left feeling lonely, depressed, and angry at many things in their lives, including their bodies, their economic situation, their love lives, and their isolation. Once again, if we take the most popular music in the West as an imperfect but usable reflection of Western society, we see that the level of permissibility around the description and display of diverse forms of sexual behavior is high. Yet it would seem that the ease of participating in such activities seems to have gotten a little more difficult. That might explain why people are so hooked on sexually charged entertainment, since given their circumstances, it may be the only avenue they have. Now, of course, these explanations should be taken with a large tablespoon of salt. First of all, you may have noticed that this focused heavily on the United States. Other Western nations have been religionless for a lot longer than the US. Yet statistics indicate the issue of loneliness, though present, may not be as detrimental as the US variety of loneliness. So is it the case that other Western nations have in a sense gotten used to it? Or am I overestimating the effect religion has on society? And countries are not the only factor I may have left out. In this video, I have neglected to talk about radical feminism, the rise of cable television, the rise of hip-hop, or the explosion of you-know-what. Any one of these factors may have played a role in our current generation's attraction to sexually irreverent music and entertainment. Then, the assertion that there is a sex recession is still being challenged by many within the world of social science. Also, there is a danger of reading too much into the lyrics. As the great poet Andre Benjamin once noted, sometimes you don't want to listen to the words of a song. You just want to dance. So what can be done? Well, that's not my job, so I don't think I can tell you. What I can tell you is that you are free to tell me what you think right in the comments below. Also, you can tap the like button and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this brief video essay. This marks the conclusion of this installment, and thank you so much for watching.